Welcome to this detailed exploration of Chinese armored vehicles during the Second World War. When we think of World War II tank forces, our minds typically turn to the mighty German Panzers, the reliable American Shermans, or the formidable Soviet T-34s. However, the story of Chinese armored warfare during this devastating conflict remains largely unknown to many military history enthusiasts. Today we will uncover the fascinating and often overlooked history of Chinese tanks during World War II, a story of adaptation, improvisation, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. China's involvement in World War II began earlier than most nations, with the Second Sino-Japanese War starting in 1937. The Chinese military found itself desperately outmatched by the Japanese forces, particularly in terms of armored vehicles. China had virtually no domestic tank production capability and relied almost entirely on foreign imports, donations, and captured equipment. This created a diverse but limited collection of armored vehicles that would serve throughout the war. Let us begin our journey through Chinese armor with the earliest tanks in Chinese service. Renault FT17. The Renault FT17 represents China's first significant experience with armored warfare. These French light tanks, veterans of the First World War, were purchased by various Chinese warlords in the 1920s and early 1930s. The FT-17 was revolutionary for its time, being the first tank to feature a fully rotating turret. Weighing approximately 7 tons and armed with either a 37mm gun or an 8mm Hotchkiss machine gun, these diminutive vehicles were already obsolete by World War II standards. The armor was minimal, ranging from 8 to 22mm, providing protection only against small arms fire and shrapnel. Despite their age, some FT-17s saw action in the early battles against Japanese forces, though they proved woefully inadequate against more modern Japanese armor. The two-man crew struggled with the tank's slow speed of just under 8 kilometers per hour and its extremely limited range. Nevertheless, these tanks represented an important first step in Chinese armored doctrine and training. Vickers Mark E, 6-ton tank. Moving forward, we encounter the Vickers Mark E, also known as the Vickers 6-ton tank. This British design was one of the most successful tank exports of the interwar period, and China acquired approximately 20 of these vehicles in the early 1930s. The Vickers Mark E came in two versions, the Type A with 2 machine gun turrets, and the Type B with a single turret mounting a 47mm gun. China primarily operated the Type B variant. This tank represented a significant improvement over the FT-17, with better armor protection of up to 25mm, a 3-man crew, and improved mobility with a top speed of 35 kilometers per hour. The 47mm main gun could penetrate most Japanese tanks of the early war period. These tanks saw action during the Battle of Shanghai in 1937 and other early engagements. However, mechanical reliability issues and the lack of spare parts meant that many were lost, not to enemy action, but to breakdowns. The Vickers tanks that remained operational were precious assets, carefully husbanded by Chinese commanders who understood they could not be replaced. Carden-Loyd tankettes. The Carden-Loyd tankettes deserve mention, though they were not true tanks. These tiny British vehicles, weighing less than 2 tons, were essentially armored machine gun carriers. China acquired several of these vehicles, which provided minimal protection with armor thickness of only 6 to 9 millimeters. Armed with a single machine gun and crewed by just 2 men, these vehicles were useful primarily for reconnaissance and infantry support in minor engagements. Their small size and relatively good mobility made them suitable for the often poor road conditions in China. However, they were vulnerable to virtually any anti-tank weapon and even heavy machine gun fire. Despite their limitations, they represented armored mobility that the Chinese forces desperately needed. Vickers amphibious tank. The Vickers amphibious tank represents one of the more unusual vehicles in Chinese service. China purchased a small number of these experimental British tanks in the 1930s. These vehicles were designed to be able to cross water obstacles under their own power, a capability that seemed attractive given China's numerous rivers and waterways. However, the amphibious capability came at the cost of armor protection and reliability. The tanks were lightly armored with a maximum thickness of just 9 millimeters and armed with a single machine gun. Mechanical complexity made them difficult to maintain, and few, if any, saw significant combat action. They remain a curious footnote in Chinese armored history. Universal carriers, Bren gun carriers. Universal carriers, known as Bren gun carriers, arrived from British and Commonwealth stocks. These were not tanks but rather tracked infantry support vehicles. Open-topped and lightly armored, they carried a crew of 2 or 3 along with a Bren light machine gun. These vehicles proved useful for reconnaissance, supply transport, and infantry support. Their relatively simple design made them easier to maintain than more complex armored vehicles. British and Commonwealth forces in Burma provided some of these carriers to Chinese forces, and they saw service in the later stages of the war. Fiat 3000. The Fiat 3000 was an Italian light tank based closely on the Renault FT17 design. China acquired a small number of these vehicles, which offered similar capabilities to the French tanks they were derived from. Weighing approximately 5.5 tons and armed with twin 6.5mm machine guns, these tanks suffered from the same obsolescence issues as the FT-17. They saw limited action in the early stages of the war before being relegated to training duties or abandoned due to mechanical failures. CV-33 tankette, L333. One of the most significant armored vehicles in Chinese service was the CV-33 tankette, also known as the L333. Italy sold approximately 100 of these light vehicles to China before World War II. The CV-33 was a 2-man tankette weighing just over 3 tons, armed with twin 8mm machine guns. Its armor, ranging from 6 to 14 millimeters, provided minimal protection. However, what the CV-33 lacked in firepower and protection, it partially made up for in numbers and mobility. These tankettes could reach speeds of 42 kilometers per hour on roads, making them useful for reconnaissance and infantry support. Chinese forces used them extensively in the early years of the war, though they proved vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank weapons. Many were lost in the fierce fighting around Shanghai and Nanjing. The survivors continued to serve in various capacities throughout the war, with some even being used in the Chinese Civil War that followed. Panzer I. Germany, before its alliance with Japan, sold China a number of Panzer I light tanks. These vehicles represented some of the most modern armor available to Chinese forces in the late 1930s. The Panzer I, while considered a training tank by German standards, was a significant asset for China. Weighing approximately 5.5 tons and crewed by 2 men, the Panzer I was armed with 2 7.92mm machine guns in a small turret. The armor thickness ranged from 7 to 13 millimeters, providing protection against small arms but little else. Despite these limitations, the Panzer I was relatively fast at 37 kilometers per hour and mechanically more reliable than many other vehicles in Chinese service. These tanks fought in several early engagements, including the Battle of Taizhuang in 1938, where they provided valuable infantry support. However, the German-Japanese alliance ended further deliveries, and the surviving Panzer I gradually succumbed to attrition and lack of spare parts. T-26 light tank. Soviet assistance to China brought several models of tanks and armored vehicles. The T-26 light tank was among the most capable vehicles to serve with Chinese forces. Based on the Vickers 6-ton design but significantly improved, the T-26 featured better armor, superior armament, and improved reliability. The most common version in Chinese service mounted a 45mm gun, capable of defeating most Japanese tanks of the period. With armor ranging from 15 to 25 millimeters and a 3-man crew, the T-26 represented a genuine threat to Japanese armor. The Soviet Union supplied approximately 80 T-26 tanks to China, and these vehicles fought in several major battles. Chinese crews praised the T-26's firepower and reliability, though the supply of spare parts remained a constant challenge. Some of these tanks remained in service well into the 1940s, testament to their robust design. BT-5 fast tank. The BT-5 fast tank also came from Soviet stocks. This cavalry tank was designed for rapid maneuvers and featured the innovative Christie suspension system that allowed it to run on either tracks or wheels. In Chinese service, however, the wheel-running capability was rarely used due to poor road conditions. The BT-5 was armed with a 45mm gun and featured relatively thin armor of 13 to 20 millimeters. Its high speed, up to 52 kilometers per hour on tracks, made it useful for exploitation and pursuit operations. China received a smaller number of BT-5 tanks compared to T-26, and they saw action primarily in the northern theaters. The complexity of the Christie suspension system made maintenance challenging for Chinese crews with limited technical training. BA-27 Armored Car. The BA-27 armored car, while not a tank, played an important role in Chinese armored forces. This Soviet six-wheeled armored car featured a turret similar to that of the T-18 tank, mounting a 37mm gun and a coaxial machine gun. The BA-27's wheels gave it better strategic mobility than tracked vehicles on China's limited road network. However, its cross-country performance was poor, limiting its tactical flexibility. These armored cars served primarily in reconnaissance roles and as mobile fire support for infantry units. T-37 amphibious tankette. As the war progressed and Soviet aid increased, China received more modern equipment. The T-37 amphibious tankette was a small reconnaissance vehicle capable of swimming across water obstacles using a propeller. Weighing just over 3 tons and armed with a single 7.62mm machine gun, the T-37 was lightly armored with a maximum thickness of just 9mm. Its amphibious capability was theoretically useful in China's river-cross terrain, though mechanical unreliability often prevented its employment in this role. A small number of these vehicles served with Chinese forces, primarily in the northern regions where Soviet support was strongest. M3A3 Stuart light tank. American aid brought significant changes to Chinese armored capabilities. The M3A3 Stuart light tank began arriving in China in the early 1940s as part of American Lend-Lease support. This represented a quantum leap in capability for Chinese armored forces. The Stuart featured a 37mm gun, up to 51mm of armor, and a reliable radial aircraft engine. Weighing approximately 14 tons with a 4-man crew, the Stuart could reach speeds of 58 kilometers per hour. Chinese forces received these tanks primarily for units being trained and equipped by American advisors. The Chinese 1st Provisional Tank Group, trained in India, was equipped entirely with Stuart tanks and M3 half-tracks. These units fought with distinction in the Burma campaign, finally giving Chinese forces armor that could match Japanese equipment on equal terms. M4 Sherman medium tank. The M4 Sherman medium tank represented the pinnacle of Chinese armored capability during World War II. A small number of these legendary tanks reached China in the final years of the war. Weighing approximately 30 tons, armed with a 75mm gun, and protected by up to 76mm of armor, the Sherman was superior to any Japanese tank it might encounter. The 5-man crew appreciated its reliability, powerful gun, and relatively good armor protection. However, China received only a limited number of Shermans, and they arrived too late to significantly impact the overall course of the war. Most remained in Burma and India with the Chinese Expeditionary Force, rather than being shipped into China proper due to logistical challenges. M3 half-track. The M3 half-track deserves mention as a crucial component of Chinese mechanized units. While not a tank, these armored personnel carriers provided mobility and protection for infantry supporting the Stuart tanks. Armed with a 50-caliber machine gun, the M3 could carry up to 13 men. Chinese mechanized units trained in the American model relied on these vehicles to maintain combined arms effectiveness. Captured Japanese tanks. Captured Japanese tanks formed another source of armor for Chinese forces. Throughout the war, Chinese troops occasionally captured Japanese Type 95 Hago light tanks, Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, and Type 94 tankettes. However, the ability to operate and maintain these vehicles was severely limited. Few captured Japanese tanks saw extended service with Chinese forces due to lack of ammunition, spare parts, and technical knowledge. Most were either quickly destroyed or abandoned. Nevertheless, any captured tank represented a propaganda victory and occasionally provided valuable intelligence about Japanese capabilities. Improvised armored vehicles. Improvised armored vehicles appeared throughout the war as Chinese forces attempted to create their own armored capability. These ranged from trucks with added armor plating to completely scratch-built vehicles constructed in workshops far from the front lines. Most of these improvisations were barely functional and offered little real combat capability. However, they demonstrated the resourcefulness and determination of Chinese forces to overcome their material disadvantages. Some of these vehicles served in training roles, allowing Chinese crews to gain experience even when proper tanks were unavailable. The challenges facing Chinese armored forces were immense. The lack of domestic production capability meant every tank lost was irreplaceable unless foreign aid could provide new vehicles. Maintenance and repair were constant struggles, with improvised solutions often necessary to keep vehicles running. Spare parts were precious commodities, sometimes leading to cannibalization of damaged vehicles to keep others operational. The diversity of vehicle types, while providing some capability, created a logistical nightmare with different ammunition types, different spare parts, and different maintenance requirements. Training was often inadequate, with crews learning on the job rather than through comprehensive programs. Coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery was difficult to achieve given communication limitations and the general chaos of the Chinese theater. In conclusion, the story of Chinese tanks in World War II is one of perseverance against overwhelming odds. China entered the war with virtually no modern armored capability and a military structure ill-equipped to employ tanks effectively. Throughout the conflict, Chinese forces made do with an eclectic collection of obsolete, worn-out, and captured vehicles, supplemented by limited foreign aid. Despite these challenges, Chinese tank crews fought bravely, often achieving results far beyond what their equipment should have allowed. The experience gained during World War II would prove invaluable in the post-war period as China began to develop its own domestic tank production capability. The legacy of these early tankers lives on in modern Chinese armored forces, which have grown from those humble beginnings into one of the world's largest tank forces. The Chinese tank crews of World War II deserve recognition for their courage, resourcefulness, and determination in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Their story reminds us that in war, the quality of the soldiers often matters more than the quality of their equipment. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Chinese armored history.